Africa speaks back. The voice, the truth, the continent on its own terms.
Africa has spoken. Now pass it on. Subscribe, like, share.
50 soldiers gone before sunrise, no warning, no alarm, just a flash of heat and silence. This wasn't a battlefield, it was an ambush. Cold, precise, and surgical. But what came next? It wasn't mourning, it was movement. Weapons didn't just fire back, an entire country did. Now pause for a second. Imagine if 50 members of your own town's National Guard were wiped out overnight. No explanation, no accountability. Would you demand answers or prepare to defend everything you've built? Because that's what Burkina Faso just did. And what you're about to witness is not just a headline, it's the foundation of a new doctrine, built not on diplomacy, but on defiance. Hey, I'm Traoré, and this is the Africa Brief, where we go deeper than the breaking news and stand at the crossroads of justice, power, and truth. If you're watching from Detroit, Lagos, Atlanta, Nairobi, or Paris, welcome. This story is your story too. Quick question before we dive in. Have you ever reached a point in life where staying silent felt more dangerous than standing up? Drop it in the comments. We're building a space where real people reflect on real decisions. Here at the Africa Brief, we don't just break news, we break it down for people who know that sovereignty isn't just about borders, it's about dignity. So if that matters to you, hit subscribe. And let's start where everything changed. It began long before the missiles, before the cameras, before the hashtags, in the dust and silence of an eastern military base where the first domino fell. It should have been a routine shift, a quiet outpost near Burkina Faso's eastern border, dusty, tired, unremarkable. Soldiers rotated watch every 3 hours. Radios were checked. Patrol dogs fed. No signs of movement, no intelligence warnings, just stillness. But sometimes stillness doesn't mean peace. Sometimes it's the setup. At 4:13 a.m., every comms line went dead. Not down dead, not jammed, erased. Burkina Faso's early warning systems, funded and installed through years of Western counter-terror programs, failed without a sound. And within 7 minutes, 53 men were gone. The attack wasn't chaotic. It was coordinated. Every blast timed, every shot accounted for. Analysts now call it one of the most precise military ambushes in Sahel history. Some even question if local insurgents could have pulled it off alone. That's the part no one wants to say out loud. Because in international diplomacy, timing is never coincidence. Just days before the attack, President Ibrahim Traoré had declined a high-level invitation to Washington. No statement, no apology, just a quiet no. The kind of no that echoes in rooms filled with suits and strategy. And then, suddenly, this. Now, in most countries, that kind of loss would shut things down. Investigations, mourning periods, a media freeze. In the U.S., it would spark months of committee hearings and primetime specials. But something different happened in Burkina Faso. Instead of paralyzing the government, it reactivated the nation. Funerals weren't held in silence. They were held in uniform. Instead of eulogies, there were promises. Instead of tears, there were plans. Because sometimes a wound becomes a weapon. Most Americans grow up believing protection is institutional. FEMA, Homeland Security, a 911 call away. But what happens when those institutions are distant, or worse, distrusted? When the call for help never comes? What do people rely on then? Maybe that's what Burkina Faso realized in that moment, that survival isn't a service, it's a mindset. And if dignity can't be delivered through aid or awards, then maybe it has to be built from scratch, even in the shadow of a funeral. From that morning forward, a shift began. Not in speeches, not in news tickers, in behavior. Soldiers re-enlisted, civilians brought food to checkpoints, and behind every handshake in the capital, there was a question few dared ask aloud. What if this wasn't a warning, but a test? A test of how far a country will go when it has nothing left to lose but itself. And the answer to that test? It didn't come from a podium or a press release. It started in a warehouse. Military factories don't get built overnight, especially not in a country that's still classified as aid-dependent by the IMF. Yet just 72 hours after the ambush, a former vehicle repair site in Ouagadougou was sealed off by armed guards. Civilian engineers, some fresh out of college, were seen entering in silence, leaving in shifts. No press, no blueprints, no fanfare. The question wasn't just, what are they building? It was, how did they build this so fast? Inside, welding torches lit up rows of stripped chassis. Not transport trucks, not armored carriers, drones, dozens of them. Long range, short range, surveillance, strike capable. And they weren't imported. That's the part that changed the equation. For decades, African defense strategy has followed a predictable model. Wait for the West. Wait for gear. Wait for training. Wait for funding. Wait, then hope. But what if a government chooses not to wait? Burkina Faso didn't just skip the queue, it burned the line. And here's what most headlines won't tell you: the facility wasn't funded by foreign investment. President Traoré reallocated over $300 million originally set aside for international development projects, roads, telecoms, NGO partnerships, into a classified military innovation fund. He didn't ask permission. He made a trade. Security over subsidies, self-reliance over optics. It's a decision most leaders wouldn't dare make. Not because they disagree, but because they know what follows. Political backlash, suspended grants, quiet warnings from friendly embassies. But here's the irony. When you stop depending on foreign approval, your people start depending on you. Across Ouagadougou, something subtle began to shift. The same citizens who used to mock broken government promises were now bringing their own tools to help reinforce the facility's outer fences. An elderly mechanic offered his skills. A university student skipped his finals to volunteer data analysis for drone sensors. Because people don't just respond to power, they respond to purpose. Most Americans are taught to measure leadership in popularity polls and televised debates. But what if leadership is just clarity in motion? A decision made quickly, cleanly, and at personal cost. And what if you could feel that decision in the air, even if you weren't in the room when it was made? The shift didn't just happen in the capital. Villages hundreds of miles away began organizing what they called defense cooperatives. Small local cells made up of teachers, farmers, and merchants. No weapons, just coordination, communication, preparedness. It wasn't about going to war. It was about not waiting for one to come knocking. And somewhere between the drone parts and the shared meals outside the facility walls, a new kind of defense infrastructure was born. One that didn't run on batteries or fuel. It ran on belief. If this kind of story matters to you, if you believe national dignity should be earned, not outsourced, then keep watching. Because belief, once ignited, doesn't fade quietly. It spreads. And in the hills outside Kaya, it had already reached its next target. Losing 50 men in one morning should have broken morale. Most militaries, especially underfunded, overstretched ones, would pause, retreat, rethink. But in Burkina Faso, enlistment went up. The blood hadn't dried, and still people were lining up. Young men from Kaya, teenagers from Bobo Dioulasso, fishermen, teachers, ex-dropouts, people with no military background, no tactical training, no guarantee they'd survive a month on the front lines. Still, they signed up. What made them do it? It wasn't glory. It was grief. Weaponized. In societies where pain has no outlet, it tends to collapse inward. But in Burkina Faso, that grief took shape. Local chiefs opened land for training camps. Tailors sewed uniforms with fabric they'd once saved for weddings. And in one village, an imam and a Christian pastor held a joint blessing ceremony over volunteer recruits. When the fabric of belief holds, structure follows. And that structure wasn't only coming from faith or folklore, it was tactical. 48 hours after the funerals, Russian military advisors landed in Ouagadougou. No press, no convoy, no announcement, straight to work. They weren't there to fight, they were there to transfer knowledge, quietly, surgically, and fast. According to sources close to the high command, what followed wasn't just training, it was redesign. Unit formations changed, recon protocols updated, even communication systems were stripped down to reduce signal traceability. But this wasn't a copy-paste strategy from another nation. It was something else, something local but unrecognizable to the old elite. Because for decades, defense in Burkina Faso had meant waiting for gear, for clearance, for international approval. Now it meant motion without permission. In American culture, people often say, freedom isn't free. But in this case, freedom wasn't bought, it was built piece by piece, move by move, and it came with a cost. Some NGOs began pulling out, foreign media tightened coverage, unofficial warnings circled embassy halls about instability, about the unpredictable direction of the government. But here's the contradiction no one likes to touch. Sometimes stability looks like silence, and progress looks like disruption. If you're leading a nation that's been ignored, how do you earn attention without becoming a headline for the wrong reasons? Most don't. Burkina Faso didn't ask for permission. It asked for sovereignty and started acting like it already had it. In a small hillside town just beyond Kaya, children were seen tracing drone flight paths in the dirt. One had wrapped a stick in red cloth and called it Kugri 1. Not because someone told him to, because he saw the symbol. And symbols, once real, replicate. When a population stops asking, who will protect us, and starts asking, what can we protect ourselves with? You don't just have a military shift, you have a cultural one, and when culture starts to move, politics tries to catch up. Whether it can or whether it dares is another story. The U.S. sent an invitation. Burkina Faso sent silence. Just days before the ambush, a high-level American delegation arrived in Ouagadougou with a purpose. Invite President Ibrahim Traoré to Washington, hand him an award, and remind the world that Western partnerships still matter. He declined. Not diplomatically, not delicately, just directly. No cameras, no quotes, no careful walk back. The president simply refused. And within a week, 50 soldiers were dead. No direct links were made, no accusations were spoken. But in the streets, and more quietly in the military, the message landed hard. Because in geopolitics, timing talks. And in Burkina Faso, timing now felt like a pattern. Then came another visitor. An American-backed NGO requested a closed-door meeting with the presidency. Denied at the gate. No comment. And again, no backlash, no diplomacy, no press release to smooth things over. What followed wasn't scandal, it was strategy. Western analysts called it arrogance, isolation, risky diplomacy. But inside Burkina Faso, something else was forming: clarity. Most Americans are raised with the idea that engagement is always good, that declining a meeting signals weakness or paranoia. But in many parts of the global south, a closed door can mean something entirely different. It can mean we know what's coming next. Because here's what often happens after handshakes fail. Funding gets delayed, headlines sharpen, and questions shift from what happened to what's wrong with them. But Burkina Faso wasn't playing that script. It started writing its own. And the cost? Real. Some infrastructure projects were suspended. A few foreign contractors packed up early. Development funds began moving slower, and some NGOs hinted at re-evaluating operational compatibility. Still, the government didn't flinch, because sometimes what you lose in grants, you gain in ground. In the capital, there was no media meltdown, no crisis team. Instead, flags were lowered, schools closed early, and President Traoré appeared, not behind a podium, but in uniform. He didn't make a speech. He made a sentence. Never again. And then he left. That moment changed how people moved. The rhythm of daily life bent slightly. People in shops spoke lower but stood straighter. Radio hosts cried on air but didn't call for pity. Street art started showing silhouettes of drones, outlined not in fear but precision. It's easy to miss moments like this unless you're watching for them. The shift between asking, who did this to us, and what do we do now? That pivot is what most policy reports never catch, because it's not written in statements. It's written in body language, in ritual, in what people stop waiting for. And while Western powers debated whether Traoré was becoming too radical, people on the ground were debating something more urgent. If we don't stand now, what part of ourselves do we lose next? And maybe that's the quietest truth in this entire story. That sovereignty isn't about independence on paper. It's about the choices made when standing alone is the only move left. In a back alley near Ouagadougou's old freight station, a mural went up overnight. No artist's signature, no explanation. Just the image of a soldier without a weapon, holding a child on his shoulders. Behind them, a sky filled with drones, and underneath, 3 words in red: on our watch. It wasn't a warning, it was a vow. Civil wars usually start when civilians pick up weapons. This time something else happened. They picked up responsibility. In less than 2 weeks, over 100 towns across Burkina Faso reported the same phenomenon. People showing up at local administration offices asking not for aid, but for assignments. They weren't soldiers, they weren't activists, they were mechanics, tailors, cooks, teachers, retired drivers, and they weren't demanding answers. They were offering capacity. The Defense Ministry didn't issue a recruitment call. There was no official mobilization notice. But the people came anyway, and so the government pivoted. Instead of pushing them away, it created a parallel network, civilian readiness centers. Not barracks, not militia outposts, multi-use spaces where basic defense training met civic education. The idea was simple. If war was going to blur the lines between front lines and front doors, then the population had to blur its role too. Most Americans have never been trained for crisis beyond a fire drill or hurricane prep. But in regions like the Sahel, where threats cross borders in pickup trucks and vanish into dry riverbeds, civilians don't just survive, they adapt. And adaptation is its own kind of strategy. The centers began small: chalkboards, open-air classrooms, maps drawn in sand. By week 3, they had instructors. By week 5, they had coordination schedules. And in one remote village near Fada, a local carpenter built wooden rifles for young trainees. Not to simulate war, but to simulate readiness. Because when fear is constant, the mind has to choose: prepare or pretend. Some parents resisted at first. What if it's too much? What if it changes them? But then they saw what it replaced: idle time, hopeless talk, trauma looping in silence, and slowly resistance faded. What emerged instead was a new rhythm: morning routines with purpose, drills with meaning, history lessons paired with territory mapping. One teenage girl from Bobo Dioulasso was asked what motivated her to join. She said, "We don't train because we want war. We train because we're tired of waiting for it." In a society where waiting had become tradition, movement was now the rebellion. And it wasn't angry, it was organized. Even the structure of the program spoke volumes. There were no uniforms, no salutes, just attendance logs, shared food, and tasks posted daily, guard shifts, supply counts, radio checks. In a village near the Ghanaian border, an old drum language, once used for funerals, was readapted to signal different types of threats. One rhythm for movement spotted, one for drone activity, one for breach. What started as self-defense was becoming self-definition. And perhaps that's the most radical transformation of all. Not that people were preparing for violence, but that they were no longer outsourcing the responsibility of peace. By the end of the month, over 12,000 civilians had signed up across 13 regions. No one promised them safety, but for the first time in years, they weren't waiting to be saved. And in the capital, the message landed. Traoré's cabinet moved to expand the program, quietly, region by region. Because this wasn't a PR stunt, it was becoming a blueprint, and the blueprint was beginning to spread. Most national doctrines start with a speech. In Burkina Faso, it started with a silence and a factory. No fanfare, no manifesto, just a chain of decisions that, when stitched together, began to look like something bigger than response. It looked like design. Inside the Ministry of Defense, a term began circulating behind closed doors: Operation Colpo. Not a military campaign, a transformation strategy. 3 pillars: civilian preparedness, technological fortification of borders, domestic weapons production under full national control. It wasn't a plan for survival, it was a framework for permanence. Over $300 million was redirected from international development budgets, quietly and without apology. Aid groups protested, foreign advisors called it reckless, but inside the country, the response was different. "Finally," one local official said, "we're funding what we actually use." That shift from dependence to direction didn't just change the military, it changed perception. Most Americans live in a political culture where strategy is something debated, often endlessly. But what if strategy in some places isn't about convincing the public? It's about showing them the cost of inaction. And what if, for once, the public agrees? After the attack, enlistment rose. Then volunteers surged. Then communities started offering land, food, logistics, not in protest, not in panic, but in rhythm. In American cities, when a crisis hits, most people look to institutions: FEMA, police, the mayor's office. But in Burkina Faso, people didn't look up. They looked around, and they moved. One village donated water systems to nearby patrol units. Another organized night signal shifts, watchers rotating with whistles and flashlights. In rural districts, retired hunters began mapping animal migration trails for use in drone routing algorithms. When infrastructure is weak, memory becomes intelligence, and tradition becomes code. But this wasn't nostalgia. It was evolution. Russian military advisors didn't just bring training manuals, they helped rewrite them with Burkinabe strategists. Drills shifted from conventional defense to asymmetrical warfare. Border guards received digital training on comms jamming, aerial interception, and counter-surveillance. In partnership with Mali and Niger, shared field exercises began. Joint operations, joint defense zones. What was once individual resistance began to look like regional doctrine. And if doctrine is the belief that certain values are worth defending no matter the cost, then this one had a very specific cost: isolation. Not everyone supported it. Some urban elites pushed back. Quiet diplomatic pressure mounted. Western embassies warned of growing militarization. But for most citizens, the alternative wasn't peace, it was passivity. And they had already tried that. The doctrine wasn't about aggression, it was about refusal. Refusal to be a target. Refusal to be a proxy. Refusal to explain the logic of defending your own land. And maybe the question now isn't whether this doctrine will survive. Maybe it's whether the region will allow it to grow, because on the edge of a dried-up airstrip in Dori, 5 teenagers lined up to paint a wall no one had asked them to. They wrote, "We are the consequence." They didn't mean it as a threat, they meant it as a fact. A war doctrine is one thing, but what happens when that doctrine starts shaping classrooms? In early July, just weeks after the first drone squadrons became operational, Burkina Faso's education ministry quietly issued a directive: update all civic education modules by the end of quarter, not for university students, for children. The new subjects: history of African borders, logic of post-colonial economic dependence, principles of national sovereignty, and most notably, how to identify media narratives designed to destabilize. To outsiders, it looked like indoctrination. To parents inside the country, it looked like overdue preparation. Most education systems, especially in former colonies, are built to explain how things are, not why they are. In Burkina Faso, that's now changing. One teacher in Banfora said her students used to memorize the capitals of European countries. Now they ask how the CFA franc was created and why it still exists. That shift may seem small, but it changes what students prepare for. If a teenager believes their future depends on migration, they study escape. If they believe their future depends on defense, they study retention. In American schools, civic education often revolves around voting, rights, and legal structures, abstract freedoms. But in countries where those freedoms are routinely interrupted by external pressure, education becomes survival training. The curriculum didn't eliminate math or science. It didn't cancel literature or geography. It reframed them. Mapping now includes drone flight paths and border surveillance corridors. Writing assignments include letters to future generations explaining why sovereignty matters. History now highlights not just colonization, but the responses to it, from Haiti to Vietnam to Zimbabwe. Because if you don't teach people how power works, they only learn how to absorb it. Some international agencies condemned the move, calling it militarization of youth. But on the ground, the tone was different. A mother in Tenkodogo said her 10-year-old son no longer asked what country he wanted to move to. He asked how many languages he'd need to defend the one he's in. That's not aggression, that's rootedness. And rootedness, once taught early enough, changes how a generation sees risk. It doesn't eliminate fear, it reorganizes it. By mid-August, more than 300 schools had adopted the updated curriculum. Teachers weren't given new uniforms or rank. They were given context. One classroom displayed a mural not of flags or heroes, but of civilians rebuilding a wall. Each brick labeled water, food, culture, memory, belief. When the wall was complete, students were asked a simple question: which one do you defend first? That question may not appear on any standardized test, but it's shaping the answers people will give when the next crisis comes. And in many parts of Burkina Faso, they're no longer waiting for that moment. They're rehearsing it. In most countries, when the government loses control, people turn inward. In Burkina Faso, they turn toward it. Not because they suddenly believed in bureaucracy or trusted politicians more than before, but because, for the first time in living memory, the state wasn't standing apart. It was standing inside. Local markets started posting defense schedules next to price lists. Neighborhood elders reviewed drone footage with junior officers. Imams and pastors began delivering sermons not about salvation, but about sovereignty. The distance between citizen and state didn't shrink. It disappeared. In Dori, a woman walked 5 miles with her 2 daughters to deliver fresh bread to a local security unit. She wasn't instructed. She wasn't paid. She said, "They stand for me. I bring what I can." Most Americans associate government with services, utilities, voting, taxes, but in Burkina Faso, government was becoming something else: shared labor. What used to be seen as official responsibility was now redefined as common cause. And once that mental shift occurred, behavior changed fast. When belief becomes distributed, so does discipline. Villages without electricity developed coded light signals to detect movement at night. Farmers altered planting cycles to match regional patrol schedules. Youth groups rehearsed evacuation drills in silence, then returned to school without disruption. This wasn't a society preparing for war. It was a society refusing to be caught off guard again, and that refusal carried a cost. Some international observers called it unsustainable. Others warned of overreach, of blurred civilian-military lines. They weren't wrong, but they weren't on the ground. Because if you ask most Burkinabe today whether they feel more controlled or more capable, they'll answer with action, not language. And that answer isn't loud. It looks like a neighbor fixing a radio antenna for a border unit, a teenager asking where the next supply drop is landing, a child drawing a drone, not in fear, but in admiration. This wasn't resilience. It was refusal to fracture. When a nation stops asking to be spared and starts organizing to endure, the nature of power shifts. Not upward, not outward, but inward, held quietly in hands that build and feet that walk toward the hard work again and again. And across Burkina Faso, that shift was no longer a theory. It was a routine. What we just witnessed in Burkina Faso isn't just a response to violence. It's a blueprint, unfinished, unstable, but undeniably in motion. One ambush didn't just trigger retaliation. It triggered redefinition. The story, of course, is still unfolding. And like any story driven by sovereignty, it's layered, political, emotional, imperfect. And look, we're aware. Content like this doesn't land the same for everyone. Some people see it as insight. Others may see it as bias or worse, propaganda. That's fair, but from my point of view, this isn't about glorifying any leader or condemning any foreign policy. It's about asking what happens when a nation decides to stop outsourcing its future, no matter the cost. I think it's complex. I think it's powerful. But mostly, I think it's a question: how much control are people really willing to claim before someone else claims it for them? If this is your first time with us, welcome. If you've been here before, you already know the next story won't be lighter, but it will be real, and it's coming soon. Stay sharp, stay human. See you in the next one.